Hello, my name is Ryan, and you are listening to the CrimeCast. In this show, we will talk about true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and cryptid creatures from all over the world, from the mountains of the Himalayas to the suburbs of Los Angeles. And for some reason, I am recording episode 6, which is another special, at 8:30 at night, while talking about one of England's most famous serial killers, Jack the Ripper, who was an unidentified killer who was based around the Whitechapel district of London between the years of 1888 and 1891. Now, you may be wondering, why is this another special? Well, actually, in about 2 weeks' time, or 1 week, I think it's 1 week or 2 weeks' time, I'm heading out to London. I'm going to England. I've never left North America before, so that's a first for me. Whoop whoop, we're at a party out there. No, it's for school. It's like for school, but it's not for school, you know? But I'm going to be gone for around 10 days, and I'm like, you know what? I need to get this episode out before, because thank God this is actually an overnight flight, because then I can sleep, get a little bit of sleep in, do a little bit of work, which is researching for our next episode, which I'll explain later on at the outro, and other things. So with that out of the way, let's get into some of the history and background. Okay, so this is the history and background. So during the late 1800s, England, but most specifically London's East End district, an area where mostly immigrants of Jewish and Russian descent, and as well as Jewish and Russian people, would live to start new lives and new businesses in London. Even though there were many people moving into this area to start a new life. The area was also known for squallows, violence, and crime, which, if you don't know what squallow means, it's basically like brothels and, brothels, yeah, that's the only other word that I can describe that as. But, I'm really sorry if this audio is like really loud. I was looking at my audio thing and it says it's loud, so I'm very sorry if this audio is loud for this whole episode. Anyways, by the late 1880s, the East End had started to become overcrowded due to the mass amounts of immigrants coming into London, as well as overcrowding. Both working and housing conditions were starting to become worse and worse. Kind of like the industrial era, if you think about it history-wise. And there would become a significant economic underclass development. So, and then a rise in this underclass development. So, basically, England was making more homes, but these homes were becoming less expensive and really cheaply built. And as well as this working conditions becoming worse, because there's so many people, they gotta build these new factories, but they have to build them with less money and less standardized conditions. Basically the Industrial Revolution. That's actually what I'm thinking of, and I know it's about 200 years after that. Yeah, about 200 years after. Maybe 100 years. I think 100 years. I may be wrong. Actually, I think this is during the Europe. Okay, whatever. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, due to this new epidemic of poverty and of course, women not being able to get factory jobs, some would become prostitutes to earn money to survive. And London's Metropolitan Police Service in October of 1888 would estimate that there was a total of 62 brothels and around 1,200 women working as prostitutes. Now that we know a little bit of history of the Whitechapel district, which is in the East End of London at this time, let's get into some of the events and the first murders that occurred in East London in the Whitechapel district. Just a quick little side note is that the first murder I talked about was not one of Jack the Ripper's victims, but it's just an example of a murder that would have taken place in the East End. So, as we said during this, now even though we're talking about murder, it was actually really rare for deaths or murders of working girls to be reported. Now, the reality for these working girls, who were at the time called, quote, ladies of the night, end quote, was that they were subject to physical attacks, and these physical attacks would sometimes result in their deaths. So a lot of deaths happen, and not a lot of them would be reported, and if they did be reported, they couldn't find the killers, really. One of these crimes was of a prostitute by the name of Emma Smith. Emma was one of these women who had been physically attacked by a group of 4 men. She would later die due to these injuries, or of Peritonitis. I think that's how you pronounce that. I'll put it up on the screen now. Tell me what that word means. Actually, watch me put it in the description of the video. I'll probably do that instead. So, now most of these women, like Emma, had been killed by gangs who were demanding protection money. So basically they were just like, hey, we need this money to protect ourselves, protect you, all this gang-related stuff. But now that we know a little bit about what these attacks and deaths would look like, I'm going to talk about one of Jack the Ripper's first victims, even though this is not part of his Canonical Five. It literally sounds like I'm writing a fan fiction. What the fuck? Anyways, so supposedly Jack's first victim would have been a prostitute named Martha Tabern. On August 6th, Martha, alongside another prostitute known as Pearly Pole or Polly, sounds like a parrot name. Anyways, were with 2 soldiers at a local pub. A pub is basically a bar for any of you Americans who are dumb enough to not know that. Sorry, that's really aggressive. Who cares? So, at around 11:45 p.m., the women, along with their soldiers, would leave the pub, and both would take their respected clients with them. By the way, prostitutes who got with men, they were called clients, if you did not know that. So yeah. So Martha and her client would go to George Yard, an alleyway on Whitechapel High Street, and of course the Whitechapel district, while Pearly Paul and her client went to Angel Alley, which was parallel to Tony B. Hall. Now, Tony B. Hall isn't that important, but it gives you an idea of what times were like, since Tony B. Hall was created to actually help the poverty issues that were in the East End at the time. So let's fast forward a few hours to the early morning of August 7th. A resident of the George Yard buildings, which is basically an apartment building, named Mrs. Hewitt, would wake up to someone screaming, quote, murder, end quote, but would ignore the noise. The reason that she would give for ignoring it was because she was so used to the domestic violence and shouts of people screaming murder and other things in the area that she just thought maybe it was one of these events. But this would be very mistakenly. She probably would feel bad after what she heard. 2:00 a.m. A couple, Joseph and Elizabeth, my honey, were returning to the buildings, and had seen no one on the stairs that led up to this building. which later Martha would be found on. Anyways, around the same time, PC Thomas Bart, the patrolling beat officer, so this is like a guy who patrols the areas and basically tries to make sure nobody's doing drugs or anything or murdering people, was questioning a soldier who was at the time loitering. The soldier would reply that he was just waiting for a friend. Now, you may be like, a soldier, could that have been the murderer? And was he waiting for a friend meeting his other soldier? Of course, this would never be answered. Around an hour and 30 minutes later, a cab driver by the name of Albert George Crow would return home and had noticed Martha's body on the first flight of the stairs, but would assume she was sleeping, which was probably another occurrence, is that they would find, like, prostitutes or other drunken men just sleeping on the steps. It wouldn't be until 5 a.m. when dock laborer John Sawyer's Rebs would find and realize that Martha was actually dead. So from around 2 a.m., so between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., Martha's body would apparently be placed on the stairwell. Anyways, after realizing that Martha was dead, John would get the officer, Officer Thomas, who would then call Dr. Timothy Robert Clean, who examined Martha's body. Yes, there's a lot of people, but it makes sense for a story not to be like, this person, oh, but we won't give you a name. Anyways, after examining Martha's body, it would be found that she had died 3 hours prior to being found. Now, once Dr. Clean arrived at around 5:30, once again 30 minutes later, he would find that Martha had a total of 39 stab wounds in her body and around her body and on her neck. When she was found, she had been she was laid down on her back with her clothing being raised to around her middle area. This would leave her around to her middle part of the body, leaving her lower half of the body exposed. And this indicated that she had been laid there in a sexual position, but during the exams, during his examination, there would be no evidence that intercourse had taken place, so it didn't seem like she was, our word and stuff like that. Okay. I'll explain that later, though. Later evidence, very sorry about that. It was found that the murderer was right-handed. And then later on, due to the location, would connect to the events of Jack the Ripper. But also many people believe that this was the first murder committed by Jack, but experts believe that this actually wasn't his first murder. But now, let's get on to the Canonical Five Ripper victims, which is what they're actually called. Literally sounds like a fan fiction. I'm going to give you guys a quick TW. I will be mentioning death and rape. No, not rape, sorry, just death and, that type of stuff, mutilation. So if you're not comfortable with that, I suggest you skip this portion of the video. So these are the Canonical Five. There's Ryann Nichols, who's 45, Annie Chapman, 47, Elizabeth Stride, 44, Kathy Eddowes, 46, and Mary Jane Kelly, who was around 25. And they would be killed between August 31st and November 9th of 1888. But you said the events took place between 1888 and 1891. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. So the first victim was Annie Nichols, who was actually known as Polly Nichols, and she was born on August 26th, 1845 in London, England. Now, so now that we know a little bit of background on her, her body would be found in Bucks Row, which is in Whitechapel, at around 3:40 a.m. on August 31st. Just around an hour before, Miss Emily Holland, who was sharing a room with Nichols at a lodging house, had seen her. Now, the lodging house was located on Thryle Street in Spitalfields, which is another area of London. While Miss Holden would have seen Nicholas walking in the direction of Whitechapel Road, so kind of like the other way, very confusing. Nicholas's body would be found with several stab wounds around her throat and lower body, but it was ruled that all her wounds had been caused by the same knife, and that her killer had used a downward thrusting manner. So kind of like how you would depict like a murder to go, that type of thing. Now let's get into Annie Chapman, who was our second victim. Annie Chapman was born as Eliza Ann Smith on September 25th, 1840 in Paddington, England, or London, England. So basically, Paddington the bear is connected to this. Very weird. Anyways, her body would be found a week later, on September 8th, at around 6 a.m. She would be found on the steps leading to the backyard of 29 Hanbridge Street in Spitalfields. Once again, a lot of mispronunciation of names and places. I'm very sorry. Same as the first victim, there would be several stab wounds around Chapman's throat and lower body. But unlike Nichols, there would be part of her flesh and skin placed above her left shoulder, while on her right shoulder her small intestine had been removed and placed there. During her autopsy, it was discovered that parts of her lower body and her organs had been removed but went missing. Later at her inquest, Elizabeth Long, an eyewitness, would describe seeing Chapman standing outside of 29 Hanbridge Street at around 5:30 a.m. with a dark-haired man. This man was wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat, and had a, quote, shabby, genteel, end quote, appearance. So basically this man looked very proper, but also very poor at the same time. According to Long, the man had asked Chapman quote, will you? And Chapman would reply with a simple, quote, yes, end quote. Now we're going to be talking about murder victims number 3 and 4, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Now the reason that I'm putting these two together, I'll explain in a minute. Well, I'll explain right now because they were both killed in the early morning hours of September 30th. So let's talk about Elizabeth Stride. She was born as Elizabeth Gustafsdottir daughter. That is so wrong. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. But was also known as Long Liz. She would be born in Torslanda, Sweden on November 27th, 1843. Now, Elizabeth Stride's body would be found at around 1 a.m. in Dutfield's Yard, which is just off Briner Street in Whitechapel. Unlike the first two murders, Stride's death would be caused by only a single clear-cut incision across her neck. Now, the reason I'm actually describing how some of these wounds had taken place will be described later on during the investigation and police reports. But due to the absence of any further stabs to her body, it's uncertain if Jack had committed the murder or if he was interrupted during the attack. Later, several witnesses would later inform the police they had seen Stride with a man either in or around Bryan Street on the evening of September 29th, in the early morning hours of September 30th. But the descriptions of the man would vary. Some said the man was fair, others said dark, with some saying he was shabbily dressed or even well dressed. So it's kind of like very conflicting, but of course, there's probably not many lights, so it's probably hard to tell. So now, Kathleen Eddowes, who would be born in Wolverhampton, Staffordshire, in England, on April 14th, 1842. Her body would be found around 3/4 of an hour before Stride. Do the math, because I can't do the math. Thus, she would be found in the corner of Midford Square in the city of London. So she was in the center of London, which is why they call it the city. Her wounds were actually consistent with the first two victims, with her neck. Now, actually, her neck had been severed, and her abdomen was cut. And just like Chapman, which was, I believe, our first or second murder, I'm already forgetting some of these victims. Some of her intestines and other organs had been placed over her right shoulder, with another section of her organs being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. Very weird. And don't worry, I'm going to explain why I'm describing some of these, some body placements too. Edwin's face had been disfigured, and police would find a triangle incision on her appendix, which would point to her eye, which actually had been removed and placed on her cheek. Later on, a section of her right ear would be found within her clothes. So she was pretty mutilated. The police surgeon would state while conducting the post-mortem, operations, the mutilations would have taken, quote, at least 5 minutes, end quote, to complete. Joseph Loyan, I'm very sorry if I mispronounced that, a cigarette salesman, alongside 2 of his friends, had passed through the square before the murder. He had described seeing a fair-haired man of a shabby appearance with a woman who may have been Eddowes. But his friends were actually unable to confirm his description, which is very odd. At around 2:55 a.m., a section of Edwin's apron, which she had been wearing during the time of her murder, had been found to the entrance of a tenement in Gulston Street, which is located in Whitechapel. Above her apron, a chalk inscription read, quote, "The dwells are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," end quote. Now, this is important because of the area. Because of where it was placed, and also the graffiti that became maybe a point of interest for the cops, which is why I'm explaining it. This would become known as the Gulston Street Graffito, and police commissioner, I don't think that's a word, whatever, Charles Warren would ask for the message to remove in the fear that it would spark anti-Semitic riots. Now, the reason that people are like, oh, this could be a sign, is that maybe somebody's blaming the death on a Jewish person, which wouldn't be shocking due to the amount of Jewish people living in London's East End at the time. Anyways, lastly, the 5th victim, Mary Jane Kelly. Now, Mary Jane had a multiple names, such as Mary Jeanette Kelly, Fair Emma, Ginger, Dark Mary, and Black Mary. We're going through all the Marys. Bloody Mary, the Queen Mary, literally. Anyway, she would be born sometime during 1863 in County Limerick, Ireland. Unlike the previous 4 murders, Jane Mary would be found at around 10:45 a.m. on November 9th, 1888. She was actually lying in a single room where she lived on 13 Miller's Court. That was just off Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Now, her face would be, quote, hacked beyond all recognition, end quote, with a cut going from her throat all the way down to her spine. Her lower abdomen had been abdomen. Her lower abdomen. That's not abdomen. I go for that word, I guess. Had been removed of almost all of its organs. So this is proving even more. This is proving to police that this may be leading to who this could actually be the murderer. Parts of her body and organs would be found underneath her head and beside her foot, around the bed, and even on her nightstand. And unlike all of the previous victims, Kelly's heart would be missing. While searching their room, ashes would be found in the fireplace, suggesting that the murderer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the single room as he mutilated her body. And that was all about her. And those were the little short descriptions of the Canonical Five. Now, for people who skipped me describing these murders, here's a quick little summary with a little bit of gruesome detailing. This is the summary. So, each of these murders had taken place at night, either near or on a weekend, with them occurring either at the end of the month or a week or so afterwards. And also, each murder, the mutilations would become increasingly more severe, all except for Strider, whose attacker had been interrupted at some point during her murder. Nichols would be the only victim who wasn't missing any of her organs. Chapman's lower organs had been removed and taken, while one of Edwin's lower organs and left kidney had been removed, and her face mutilated. Lastly was Kelly's body, which had her organs removed and placed around her body, face, and other parts, and her face had been, quote, gashed in all directions, end quote, with only her heart missing. Very gruesome. It is believed that the 5 canonical murders were committed by the same person. This comes from multiple documents. One comes from Sir Melvin Mackinac in 1894, who was an assistant chief constable of the Metropolitan Police Service, and was also head of the Criminal Investigation Department, would write in a report, quote, "The Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only," end quote. The second document that believes that crimes were also committed by the same person was written by police surgeon Thomas Bond, who head of the London CID, Criminal Investigation Department, Robert Anderson, on November 10th, 1888. Very quick, very brief summary. Now, in one of these letters, they state that maybe this person was a surgeon because of the way that these ladies had been murdered. But they would bring that theory into their investigation, which is our next section of this. Great segue there. Wow, I'm actually really good at that. Anyways, so we're actually to fast forward a little bit to the London Blitz, which is a very important time for London. That's like a history thing. I'm a history buff, but I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to hear history stuff from me, just let me know. Maybe I'll do a history episode where I just talk about history. Anyways, so during the London Blitz, which was around 1940 to 1941, vast majority of the City of London's police files relating to their investigation into the Whitechapel murders were destroyed, which I find really interesting. How did multiple files get destroyed? I thought maybe they would keep that like secret because those were like unidentified murders. They may want to be like, wait, what if we ever get like, whatever. A large team of policemen, not said when, So this was, I believe, after the, this was before the London Blitz, I believe, would conduct house-to-house inquiries throughout Whitechapel. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from the inquiry entirely, with more than 2,000 people being interviewed, with, quote, upwards of 300, unquote, people were actually investigated, with 80 people being detained. Kind of crazy. Now, these suspects were either butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, and physicians because of the manners of the mutilations, which I stated earlier. Major Henry Smith, who was acting commissioner of the city police, indicts that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, with the results that they were eliminated from the inquiry, because, like, so they interviewed, like, their alibis, and their alibis were like, yeah, they were here, like, here's, like, the paperwork or stuff to prove it. Anyways, a report from the chief inspector, Donald Swasson, confirms that 76 butchers and slaughterers had been visited, and the inquiry would cover all of their employees from the previous 6 months. Some conspiratorious figures, some figures at the time, very important figures, included Queen Victoria, would think that the pattern of the murders indicated that the culprit was a butcher or cattle drover on one of the cattle boats that piled between London and mainland Europe. This was due to how close Whitechapel was to the docks, which actually is stated in the Emma Smith murderer, who, with the person finding her being a dock worker. Anyways, during September of 1888, a group of volunteer citizens from London's East End would form the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and patrol the streets looking for suspicious characters due to their dissatisfaction with the police. So basically, these people created their own police department to find the Whitechapel murderer, aka Jack the Ripper. What the hell? Oh my god, that's actually so funny to me. Anyways, one of the most important pieces of evidence during this time were the letters. The letters, the letters. As I said and stalled a little bit, the letters were some of the most important pieces of evidence during the Whitechapel murders, in which the police, newspaper, and others would receive hundreds of letters about this case. And this kind of reminds me of the Zodiac killer here in the States. How he would write to newspapers mostly and the police and have all these, like, they would have to decipher it, and, like, he didn't even use his own handwriting, which is shocking. Anyways, these are these letters. These are 2 or 3 of the most popular letters. The first one we'll talk about is the Dear Boss letter. Addressed to the Central News Agency of London on September 25th, 1888, so that's when this letter was written, with the CNA, receiving the letter on September 7th. September 29th, the CNA would forward it to Scotland Yard, which, if you're a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, you know what Scotland Yard is. If you're not, just look it up. Just look it up, because, come on, you gotta know what that is. It's basically a newspaper. Anyways, the letter was written in red ink, and was 2 pages long, and was filled with several spelling and punctuation errors. This guy was probably dyslexic, so don't hate on this man. The overall motive of the author was to basically mock the investigation efforts And here's what the letter said. Quote, Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quite ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work, and I want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I have some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next time I do, I shall clip the lady's ear off and send it to the police, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a good bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get any chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hand. My hand's cursed. Not luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha ha. End quote. As you can see, very mysterious, has a lot of spelling mistakes and such. The next is the Saucy Jackie postcard. A postcard, not a letter, but still very important. A postcard received by the Central News Agency of London on October a postcard would be received by the Central News Agency of London on October 1st, 1888. Contact information deemed compelling enough to lead investigators to publish a copy of the card. Investigators hoped that someone might recognize the handwriting. Mentioned in this letter, this postcard mentions the two victims killed on September 30th and how they were killed very close to one another. Some authors have argued that the letter was sent before the murders were publicized, making it unlikely that a hoaxer would have such knowledge of the crime. The letter was postmarked more than 24 hours after the killings took place, long after many details were known by both journalists and residents of the area. The postcard would read, quote, I was coding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event. This time, number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had no time to get ears off for police, thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper, end quote. And as you can see, both of these letters / postcards had Jack the Ripper as the murderer's name, which actually gave them the name. At first, it was called the Whitechapel Murders, but these letters gave him a name. And lastly, this is From Hell, the From Hell letter. This letter was also known as the Lusk letter and was sent to George Lusk, who was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Why does this committee have to come up with the letter being written on October 15th, 1888, and Lusk receiving it the following day? It was sent alongside a half-preserved human kidney. Very interesting. An examination of the kidney revealed the individual from whom the organ originated had suffered from Bright's disease, which is I think it's a kidney disease if I'm right from my research. Anyways, with the author claiming that they had fried and eaten the other half. One of the few articles of correspondence that has received serious... So they believe that this is one of the few articles that could have been really serious. Put it that way. This letter came into possession of the City of London Police. It will be later transferred to the Metropolitan Police. Yeah. Anyways, this is what the letter said. Quote, From Hell. Mr. Lusk sore. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman's preserved it for you 2/3 pieces. I fried and eat it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk, end quote. This one also had very prominent spelling mistakes, but also that could have been like the writer themselves. So yeah, and that's Jack the Ripper for you kids. And that was the case of one of the most famous serial killers in England, Jack the Ripper, who was an unidentified killer who was based around the Whitechapel district of London between the years of 1888 and 1891. And this man still has not been found. Anyways, so we're actually taking a trip down memory lane with episode 7 and going back to the Cecil Hotel. But instead of talking about its hauntings, we will be looking into one of its most famous cases in video. That is of Elisa Lamb, who went missing while staying at the hotel, but be later found by a hotel worker on the roof of the hotel's water tanks. Now, I want to say that this episode was really fun to investigate because not much information is known about the investigation portions of Jack the Ripper, which is crazy, and it's still not solved today. But I really do think that some of that maybe that first letter was a fake, but they gave themselves a name in those letters, just like the Zodiac Killer did. The name Jack the Ripper came from those letters. At first, they were just the Whitechapel murders. But then Jack the Ripper came along and gave him the name. And to this day, those are still not, they're not solved. But if you watch, I'm really taking a flashback to my anime phase. Black Butler, they solved this case. They found out who Jack the Ripper was. So if you want to know who they caught, go check out Black Butler. I think they found Jack the Ripper. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll see you guys in episode 7, and I'll actually see you guys when I'm done in London. Yeah, wow, that's really weird to say. Bye, guys.